Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Terry Ryder, founder and managing director of Hotspotting, and today I'm having a discussion with our guest presenter, Miriam Sandcooler, about the best places to buy in Victoria. It's a very timely webinar because of the changes taking place in our major markets, and in particular the way mainstream media is reporting those changes. What we know to be true at Hotspotting is that while sections of the Melbourne market are definitely winding down after a strong upcycle, key parts of regional Victoria are doing pretty much the opposite. I think it's fair to say that most of the locations with the strongest price growth anywhere in the nation in the past year have been in regional Victoria. Some of them have been above 20% in terms of annual growth in their prices. And perhaps more importantly, there's more to come, especially in the specific locations that we'll be discussing today. Now, in terms of finding out what's going on at the coalface of markets in Victoria, there's no better person to speak to than our guest presenter today. Miriam Sandcooler is an award-winning buyer's agent and best-selling author of the very good real estate investment book, Property Prosperity. And a property professional has considerable experience, not only in Melbourne, but in many of the leading markets of regional Victoria, which we're discussing today. Miriam, welcome.
Thank you, Terry. It's great to be here again.
So, I think this is a great topic today. It's very timely, as I said in my introduction, in terms of the different things that are happening in markets around Australia. We're getting too much generalisation, I think, out of our major media in terms of the way they're reporting, very influenced by what's happening in Sydney. Unfortunately, most of our media comes out of Sydney and they're being overly influenced by their home markets. But what you and I know to be true is that there's some very different things happening in different parts of Australia with property markets right now.
That's exactly right, Terry, and I think there's some really strong fundamentals behind what's happening in Victoria, particularly in terms of state and federal government throwing a lot of money into the infrastructure as to what's happening around here. Victoria is really singing a very strong song around investment into the state, and that's reflected in what's happening in Geelong, Ballarat and Bendigo.
Absolutely right. Just before you launch into your presentation, it's very much your presentation, but also there'll be some discussion between yourself and myself about our different views of these markets, looking at it from different perspectives. I just remind people that you have the opportunity to put the questions to us. You'll see a Q&A panel and also a chat panel in front of you on your screens, and you can type your questions in there at any time during the presentation. And towards the end of the hour today, I'll be putting some of those questions to Miriam to give you some straight answers. So Miriam, over to you.
Thank you so much, Terry. Well, firstly, I just want to start by saying, as usual, we're not providing any tailored financial, tax, legal, property advice, and we strongly recommend that you seek independent accounting, legal, finance and property advice from an expert before embarking on or actioning any of the information disclosed in this presentation. So, as Terry said, Property Mavens, well, we're an integrated property advisory firm, and our expertise is in buyer and vendor advocacy and providing property portfolios for clients. So we work with home buyers, sellers and investors. We find and buy high-performing investment-grade properties, and they're the ones that outperform the market. We help people find the right property for their budget, and we also help people sell their properties when they're looking to do that too. So personally, I'm a licensed estate agent. I choose to work as a buyer's advocate. I'm an accredited property investment advisor. I do a lot of media commentary. And as Terry mentioned, I have my best-selling book, Property Prosperity, and I've got an offer for you at the end of the webinar regarding that. So if we talk about the hottest property markets in Victoria, this is what we're going to deal with today. We're going to talk about the market, what's happening in Geelong, Ballarat and Bendigo specifically. So if we talk about the market, as Terry mentioned, there isn't one single national market. There are thousands of markets and sub-markets all around Australia. Prices can often vary according to the particular suburb, according to the pocket within the suburb, according to the street within the suburb, according to the side of the street on the suburb, and then down to the property and the attributes of it itself. So property performance will vary according to supply and demand of stock as well, and then buyer and tenant type too. So it's really important that if you are looking at any market in Australia, that you do zero in and you do your own research. Obviously, Terry's reports are fantastic for that, and try and not pay attention to what's going on in the media, because it is doom and gloom. They do chop and change what they say from one day to the next, and it's pretty unreliable. So if we look at what's driving growth in regional areas currently, particularly in Victoria, well, it's certainly affordability. There's a strong story there of a lot of first home buyers moving to regional areas because they've been priced out of Melbourne, particularly as a result and a consequence of the boom that we've had over the last 5-6 years in particular. There's a lot of infrastructure development going on across all of these three regional centres. There's an enormous amount of employment opportunities presenting themselves, in particular associated with that infrastructure development. Substantial population growth is driving it as well. A lot of private investment as well as federal and state government investment. And then, of course, tourism applies as well, certainly in the Geelong and the Ballarat areas. So fundamentally, when you're looking to invest in any property, you certainly want to make sure that you do your research and look at the growth drivers, and you always want multiple growth drivers before considering buying into a particular location. So that's where these regional areas are very much ticking the boxes.
Miriam, I think it's really important for people to understand the point you're just making, and that is that real estate markets are very much fundamentally driven by what's happening in the local economy. Economists tend to talk about national factors, they talk about the level of interest rates, they talk about the impact of Banking Royal Commission, and they tend to talk about Australia as a single market. But what we're telling people today as a very important message is that there's not one market, and that the markets, the thousands of different markets, are all driven by local conditions, what's happening with the local economy in particular.
Absolutely. And the other thing to take into consideration is that regional markets also differ to major cities when investing as well. So what might appeal to a city resident doesn't necessarily apply in the regional area. So it's really important that you don't filter properties with CBD perception, for want of a better word, and that you get to know and understand the demographic of who's actually living in those regional areas. So you really want to understand who your buyer demographic is, who's buying there, what are they buying for, how long are they buying for, particularly when it comes to owner-occupiers and people relocating from the city areas, as well as obviously the locals who've grown up there and what they're looking for in terms of when they buy into the area as well. You want an understanding of the tenant demographic and what's important to them. So, for example, in certain regional areas, I know that tenants absolutely want storage and they want things like garages and sheds. They have the ability to live in a house, usually with a generous block of land attached to it, and they have stuff and they want to be able to store that stuff. So it's important that while certainly inner city, CBD, Melbourne may not have that as a driving factor because the cost of land value is so high, that's very much a consideration in certain regional areas. Things like public transport, access to public transport is great. Close access in some areas isn't necessarily as important. I mean, certainly the more Melbourne residents that are relocating to Melbourne, they will start driving that demand for that cafe and that sort of Melbourne lifestyle. However, they don't necessarily all need to have a 5-minute walk to the train in terms of where they're living. Certainly a lot of regional areas have got a great bus network. They might not have as much available in terms of the train stations or the number of train stations. Public transport's still a consideration, but people are also happy to drive to a station or walk a little bit of a longer distance as well. So just factor that in, that it's not necessarily as important. Private schooling is a factor in some of these areas. Certainly Geelong's got some great private schools as well as Ballarat. And a lot of people have for a long time been sending their kids to school in Ballarat, even if they're boarding. And in some instances now, the cost of schooling in Melbourne's getting so expensive that it's actually proving to be more affordable to possibly even consider packing up the family and relocating to places like Geelong and Ballarat for that. Cafe lifestyle, I mentioned before, it is being driven by Melbourne people relocating, and demand for that will grow over time, but it's not necessarily a huge factor right now. Things like proximity to beach, lake, water, Geelong we'll be talking about shortly, and being right on the coast. That's driving a lot of growth there because people do want access to that lifestyle, and being close to the places like Anglesea and Torquay is driving that as well. Certainly in Ballarat, we've got Lake Wendouree. So again, take into consideration where people are living around bodies of water and is that important to them and why. Now, climate's a really interesting one, and you do have to take into account the consequences of climate. Certainly Geelong, being on the coast, is a little bit cooler in summer than, say, Ballarat. Ballarat can get very, very cold in winter and very hot in summer, being inland, and Bendigo's a little bit the same. So you have to consider what a tenant's going to want in that situation, and basically it means they want really good heating in winter and they absolutely want air conditioning and cooling in summer. So if you're buying properties that don't factor those two things in, you're probably going to struggle to get a good tenant. So whilst those things cost money, they're an imperative to make sure that your property that you're buying, whether it's an owner-occupier property or particularly tenanted property, is going to attract the right tenant who will pay the rent for that property to have those those services available, or rather those things provided. And the other thing really to take into consideration, what's also been driving growth in these three areas, is the ability to commute to the capital city for work. So certainly Geelong on the fast train, you're talking about sort of just over an hour's commute. You've got access on the freeway as well, albeit that can be a bit jam-packed in the morning. Ballarat, same thing, fast train, hours commute, and Bendigo a bit longer. So that's also what's driving growth in these regional areas, the fact that people can get into an affordable lifestyle. They've got all sorts of amenity available to them, including employment opportunity. But if they still do want to work from out, and commute to Melbourne, they can do that in an easy time frame. And I'd suggest an hour on the train, reading a book or dealing with work on your laptop is going to be a far better commute than 2 hours in a car, stuck on a freeway.
Miriam, can I just ask you, do you have a feel for how many of the people, I know there's a lot of people out of Melbourne showing interest in locations like Ballarat and Bendigo. Do you have a feel for how many of them are actually going to be working still in Melbourne or working locally? Because these are, in their own right, strong local economies which are creating jobs and opportunities. So what sort of a breakdown is there in terms of working locally, working back in Melbourne?
Yeah, look, I don't have an actual breakdown, but speaking with agents locally, particularly in Ballarat, I know they've got probably 16 families a week moving to Ballarat. A lot of people will move there and rent there first, which is contributing to why there's such a low vacancy rate. And it's also contributing to why the market's so heated, because investors are wanting to get in as well as home buyers from Melbourne, but then we're also competing with first home buyers who live in Ballarat itself. So I don't have the breakdown as to who's working locally and who's commuting, but certainly it's a good indication of how many families are relocating there on a weekly basis.
But I guess the point is there's opportunities for both types of people. It's certainly very conceivable to live in a city like Ballarat and commute to jobs in Melbourne.
Absolutely.
Not everybody has to go right through the CBD. A lot of jobs in northern Melbourne as well, big job nodes up to the northern part of the city.
Yeah. And also in the west, like Sunshine, for example, so there's a lot more infrastructure going on in Sunshine and a lot of development there. So some people are commuting from, say, Ballarat to Sunshine, and then Bendigo, they're commuting to the northern suburbs and northern pockets where there's also activity as well. So not everyone's coming all the way into the CBD. So there's that opportunity to get to work and travel for even less than that full trip. Beautiful. Okay, so one thing I will say, when you are buying into a regional area, you have to be really careful about what you take into consideration and not to make mistakes. Firstly, don't compare prices to Melbourne, because you will be overpaying. I see it all the time. People look at a property in, say, Ballarat or Geelong and they go, wow, this is really cheap compared to Melbourne, and they tend to throw too much money at it. Because they're actually not comparing it to Ballarat prices, they're comparing to Melbourne, and inevitably they end up overpaying substantially. So do your local research, make sure you're understanding what the market is in Ballarat, what it's going to pay for comparable properties in Ballarat, and then offer prices accordingly to meet the Ballarat market. Always make sure you inspect the property. I'm a strong believer of the fact that you can't buy a property sight unseen. Obviously, photographs are designed to sell a property. In some instances, those photographs make the property look much better than it is in reality. And sometimes they don't do it justice, but it's imperative that, you do have feet on the ground to inspect that property, because the photos will show you what they want you to see, but there's all the stuff that's hidden that they never show you as well that you need to take into consideration. The other thing is be wary of commission housing. There is a lot of established commission housing in these regional areas. They're not necessarily high-rise blocks or anything like that, and there can be concentrated pockets of commission housing or lower socio-economic areas in particular parts of particular suburbs in each of these areas as well. So just take that into account. Understand all local agents operate differently. Certainly I'm seeing a few more auctions happening in Ballarat than Ballarat would usually normally have. They don't always work. You know, certainly last weekend I know there were a number of auctions, or a couple of weekends ago, that have failed, and some agents have had, you know, 7 auctions in a row fail because the local market doesn't respond very well to it. So again, just understand how each agency in each area operates and how they'll handle offers and so forth when you're buying. Be aware that underquoting still happens, just as a general rule of thumb. Always do your due diligence, as I said, so make sure you're getting contracts reviewed, building and pest inspections done by local inspectors. They have an enormous amount of knowledge, including history as to the type of properties that were built and what they were built of and what they were made of, and things that you might need to take into consideration and account. Ideally stay away from house and land packages. You know, certainly there are a lot of these being developed on the outer fringes of some of these suburbs, which is where a lot of investment's coming in, and it's providing employment, but it doesn't necessarily stack up as a good investment. I always talk about asset selection is everything. If you get it wrong, well, it's going to cost you a lot of money. And always buy for land value. So in the purchase price of the property, you want as much of that purchase price tied up in land value than in the property value. And unfortunately, in house and land packages, you usually get the reverse of that, which is why they often don't go up in value. I liken it a little bit to buying a brand new car and driving off the lot and it's lost money straight away. That's usually what happens with house and land packages in these regional areas as well. Or it will take you a very long time for the market to catch up to the price that you paid. Again, pricing, I was talking about that before. Don't compare it to Melbourne, look at the local markets and understand that there are 3 prices. You know, there's always the price a buyer wants to pay, which is a figure they've got set in their mind. There's the price that you need to pay according to the actual market value of the property at the time, and then there might be a different price based on the level of interest and competition at the time as well. Again, I find regionally you don't have to go to insane and offer ridiculous amounts of money over the top, but again, be aware of the fact that in a competitive environment in a really hot market, if you don't compete and find that balance of buying without overpaying, then you can continue to miss out, and then obviously miss out on capital growth. Analysis paralysis, be careful. This is always something that where people get stuck. In a fast market, if you don't take any action, basically time out of the market costs money. And I'll give you some examples of what that looks like. Terry, did you want to make any comments on that, just what I've gone through there?
I'm actually really interested to get your perceptions on the differences of, you know, particularly in the situation we're talking about. We're going to be discussing markets like Geelong, Ballarat and Bendigo. A lot of the buyers, both investors and home buyers, are coming out of Melbourne, but applying perhaps too often a Melbourne mentality to buying in those locations, and the importance of understanding that there are differences, and particularly with pricing. Potentially that's perhaps how some of the price growth happens in locations like a Ballarat, that Melbourne people are paying a little bit too much. But
absolutely, yeah.
What's the best way for people to avoid doing that? Is it get an independent valuation? Is it to have a professional like yourself on the team? How can people avoid that very important issue of not overpaying?
Yeah, well, they have to understand how to price property and how to assess genuinely comparable properties. I mean, I know we have a statement of information, but that doesn't always end up providing a genuinely comparable property when you're considering purchasing it and determining the price. So that can be a little bit tricky. And if you can't do that, then honestly engage someone such as myself who's a buyer's advocate. I mean, I know I've been buying in Ballarat for the last 5 years. I certainly know the areas very well. I've got great relationships with agents. Those relationships help me get outcomes in a really timely manner for my client. And it doesn't mean I'm always buying a bargain, but it's the difference between buying versus missing out time and time again. Because again, time out of the market is capital growth that you're not earning. Look, you can get a sworn valuation, but the fact of the matter is you don't want to do that by your bank that you're borrowing through, because if you end up having to pay more to secure the property than what the valuation sits at, then the bank will more likely honour the valuation, not the contract price. So you can get a little bit unstuck there. And again, a valuation is a price on a property at a fixed point in time. It doesn't factor in competition and the level of interest in that property. So that might be the value. But as I talked about before, you know, when I spoke about XYZ price, Z is the price you need to pay under competitive circumstances. And again, if you don't want to overpay, that's where working with an expert like myself can help you.
Okay.
So I'll give you an example. This property here I bought for a client last year in February, paid $370,000. Now, that was a situation where, being familiar with the area, I was able to come in, have a look at it. I was aware of the fact that there was another buyer's agent coming in 3 hours after me. I knew the property ticked the boxes. I knew it was investment grade. I'd worked with my client and they understood my process and methodology, and we'd already missed out on a couple of properties. So I was in a position where I was able to put an offer in basically then and there on the spot. I was able to secure that property for $5,000 under the vendor's reserve. I was able to buy it before that other buyer's advocate got to it. Having the relationship with the agent, we were able to do a handshake deal, and it was subject to building and pest inspection, which we did while we're waiting on the contract anyway. So I was able to secure that for my client, ultimately unconditionally. And when the property manager had their first open home, or home inspection rather, for tenants, they had 19 groups through, and as a result of that one open, they had 9 tenants apply for the property. So it just goes to show that the right property in the right location with the right attributes, and taking into account tenant demand and the demographic of who's buying into Ballarat, can very much show up very strongly in terms of the level of interest in a property, and this being a perfect example. And you know, I've got multiple case studies like that.
Miriam, what was it about this particular property that made it investment grade and made it, you know, the right property, and the one that the tenants were so hot about?
Yeah, well, it was really neat and tidy. It didn't need any money spent on it. It had a good layout. This one in particular had 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. It had a great aspect. It was actually really close to Ballarat High School zone, which is a sought-after school as well. So across multiple attributes, it really ticked the boxes, and it was a good price. You know, now that property today, it's probably a little bit conservative to say it would sell for $410. I think it would probably actually get $420. So my clients had really good capital growth in that time frame.
Okay.
Beautiful. Okay, so I suppose let's talk about some of these areas. So particularly Geelong, some of the highlights as to what's going on with Geelong is incredibly strong population growth, hospital upgrades, real economic diversification. There's a $5 billion regional rail link that's been completed recently. The growth at Deakin University, there's the $2 billion Armstrong Creek project, which is a development and a subdivision of multiple blocks of land obviously being released. We've got the $4 billion Point Henry project, the upgraded Avalon Airport, and correct me if I'm wrong, Terry, but I think they've just launched it in terms of it receiving international flights from China. Yeah, so there's a lot going on there. And then, of course, you know, if we look at the population demographics and core influences and what's going on typically with pricing, yeah, there's some information there that you might like to also add in the mix, Terry.
Yeah, I think one of the key things about Geelong, and emphasising the point that strong property markets come out of what's happening in the local economy. The key thing about Geelong is it's one of those cities and economies that's reinvented itself. The days of Geelong being sort of like a blue-collar economy, a manufacturing economy, those days are pretty much gone. It's actually very successfully evolved from those old style, that old style economy that it used to be, into a very modern economy where the biggest employers now are the education sector and the health sector. Those are very, very strong elements. You mentioned the expansion of the university. That's a huge factor for Geelong. But increasingly it's emerging as a very modern city with a modern economy, things happening such as the location of the NDIS national headquarters in Geelong, and the fact that a lot of businesses that somehow are related to that particular government organisation want to be close to us, so it's created a new precinct in Geelong. Its strong links to Melbourne are important, but it's very much a very strong regional city in its own right. So a lot of people, I imagine, who buy there do commute back to Melbourne for work, but a lot of people don't need to because they have jobs locally, because the local economy is so vibrant, notwithstanding the closure of the car plant and the end of some of those old style industries. We did some research at one point not so long ago and found that the new jobs being created in Geelong outnumber the ones being lost through events such as the closure of the car plant. New jobs outnumber the ones being lost by a factor of 12 to 1. So it just emphasises how strong Geelong has emerged from that evolution, that change. And that has come in our property boom for the last 2 years, where we've seen price growth in the suburbs of Geelong, probably the highest anywhere in Australia in the last 12 months.
Yeah. And look, it's also got that position of having very much a water-based lifestyle there. There's been significant government spending on that transport infrastructure and relocation of government agencies to Geelong as well. And so what is also happening in Melbourne is you're getting people downsizing. So frequently what's going on is they're selling their property in Melbourne, they're buying a smaller property or an apartment in Melbourne, and then they're investing and having more of a lifestyle property in Geelong because they've also got access to, the Great Ocean Road and the lifestyle down there. So Geelong's a really great place to enjoy the lifestyle in Geelong itself, to have easy and ready access to Melbourne, and then also to hit the Great Ocean Road and enjoy Anglesea, Torquay, Lorne and that kind of lifestyle as well. Lots of vineyards opening up in and around Geelong and the Bellarine Peninsula too. So that's, from a tourism point of view, attracting a lot of people as well. So tourism's quite a strong industry in that area as well.
Yeah, one of the things that stands out for me about Geelong, it's important to emphasise that lifestyle aspect, the fact that it is essentially a peninsula, so surrounded by water and many different types of water as well. But it's the diversity of real estate, the range of the price ranges that are available on the screen. We've got Barwon Heads, for example, where the median price for a house is not that much under $1 million, but all sorts of shades in between that and suburbs like working class suburbs like Corio and North Lane, where the median prices are the low 300s, despite very, very strong growth above 20% in the last 12 months. So you've got great diversity in the market, lots to choose from, depending on what your price point is or the lifestyle you're looking for.
Yeah, and key projects identified as well. I've got here $1 billion freight transport hub neighbouring Avalon Airport. So again, employment opportunities are huge. I think if anyone's got kids and they're looking for a profession, the trades are going to be screaming out in Victoria for people that are qualified across, different sectors as well. So that's certainly, from an employment perspective, that's a strong driver. And they're forecasting that in 20 years' time, Geelong's going to have a population of 300,000. So absolutely, Geelong's already Victoria's second largest city, but that's, substantial population growth by that time as well.
Yeah, and emphasising that the current population of the city of Greater Geelong is about 230,000. So they're projecting that within perhaps just a little over, less than 20 years, it's going to increase by another 100,000 people. One of the factors that, talking about the Geelong property market, that stands out for me is that the vacancy rates are so low. Many of the postcodes in the city of Greater Geelong have vacancy rates below 1%, and others are, say, 1.5%. So very tight market. It's all indicative of the population growth, the vibrancy in the economy, people coming in there not only to live but to work.
Yeah. So lots going on in terms of education, development of infrastructure around education, health and medical facilities. There's a lot of commercial development going on just generally. So again, sports and entertainment. So if you've got anything to do with anything along the lines of construction or those associated industries, there's huge potential here. So again, coming back to multiple growth drivers, employment, infrastructure, population growth, definitely Geelong ticks the boxes in that respect.
Okay.
Beautiful. All right, so let's move on to Ballarat. So Ballarat basically is the #1 growth market in Victoria. They've basically got a $950 million wind farm situated there, and that sector is looking at growing. They've done major transport upgrades, and that'll continue on potentially for the next 20 odd years. They're doing a $460 million hospital upgrade. Basically, the amenity in Geelong can really easily cope with a population of around 120,000, of which we're only around that 100,000 mark to date. There's a Ballarat West growth zone. There's a regional centre for manufacturing, agriculture, education, tourism, health services, retailing and mining. And Geelong has, Ballarat has also got a long track record of gold mining, and there's a lot of tourism around that as well. So again, really affordable. You've got your price point, your first home buyers really relocating to Geelong. You can see the typical prices there. There are some more expensive suburbs. You do have your $1 million plus properties in and around Soldiers Hill and Lake Wendouree, but you can actually buy quite well as a first home buyer, and you can actually get in as an investor and get some really good yields around Ballarat. I mean, yields, once upon a time, you could get 6% fairly readily. Now 5% is a little bit more the norm. Usually in these regional areas, you know, tenants do have a bit of a cap mentally in terms of how much they'll pay to live in a property. Obviously, it does depend on what the property is and where it is and how spec'd out it is. But certainly rentals are affordable. Yield is still quite good. Again, population growth here projected by 2040 to grow to 200,000. It is one of Australia's largest inland cities, and the main influences are definitely transport infrastructure, boomtown government policy, and lots of access in future with the trains being upgraded and the roads being upgraded. One of the benefits with Ballarat is it's an hour commute to Melbourne. It'll be a shorter commute to Sunshine. The federal government's looking at investing in developing a rail link to the airport, which will come out of the Sunshine Hub. So that'll certainly give people in Ballarat and those regional areas access to the airport much more readily as well. So lots of things going on there.
It's a very, very vibrant city. I love regional centres like Ballarat as places to consider that has that economic diversity that we always look for. It's very go ahead. It's an innovation city. There's a lot happening in terms of the education sector, the innovation precincts. Another thing to like about Ballarat, it has some very large businesses that operate nationally, in some cases internationally, but located locally. And very big employers, and they're growing, so jobs are being created. It's not purely a case of commuting back to Melbourne for work. There's plenty of opportunities for careers in Ballarat as well.
Yeah, well, some of those employers, we've got Hames Paints, Master Food, McCain. Ballarat's got one of the lowest youth unemployment rates in the country. So that's a fantastic story there. We've got education and health, you know, couple of universities there. So Federation University is the largest institution with 3 campuses in Geelong. Tourism, interestingly enough, the Goldfields is a really strong tourist precinct, particularly with Chinese visitors who are actually tracing their family heritage associated with the Goldfields. We've got Sovereign Hill, which is a bit of an open-air museum, and that's a major attraction for Victoria as well. And definitely more of that lifestyle element is coming to Geelong as well. So some really good restaurants are opening up. Again, people relocating from Melbourne and demanding more of that cafe lifestyle is being, there's demand for that as well. And as I said, the health sector, you know, we've got Ballarat is Western Victoria's largest provider of healthcare, and certainly as more people retire to Ballarat because of the healthcare services that are available, that's also going to continue to push demand for property in the area as well and continue to drive growth.
There's some things that really stand out about the Ballarat property market for me. One is that the pricing. The pricing on the screen is fairly typical in terms of median prices for suburbs in Ballarat. You mentioned, Miriam, that there still are $1 million home areas, but that kind of pricing is fairly typical, and the sort of prices that you can pay and get investment grade property are similar to the case study that you mentioned earlier. Another is that vacancies, as we mentioned with Geelong, vacancy rate for Ballarat is very low, below 1% at the moment. A lot of demand for various reasons. And I think the key factor is that we're already seeing some very strong price growth in Ballarat, but I believe it's at the beginning of a cycle. Some of the suburbs have had double-digit growth in their median prices, but I think there's plenty more to come because Ballarat's really just getting underway, whereas Geelong has actually been screaming along for a couple of years. Ballarat's much earlier in the cycle, therefore it's much more of an opportunity to buy well and expect some short-term growth as well as long-term growth.
Yeah, and look, if you've got a slightly lower budget, you're sort of getting better bang for buck in Ballarat at the moment than you are in Geelong. So if you're towards that sort of 350 end rather than the 400, 500, 600 end, you can actually still buy quite well in Ballarat at the moment. Obviously, that price point's getting a little bit scarcer as more and more people are competing for it. But yeah, look, I've just purchased a property for a client recently for a budget of two clients actually. Each of them had a budget roughly of 320,000 and they're both getting a 5% yield. So the opportunity is still there with the lower end of the budget as well. So definitely from that point of view. And I think ultimately with Ballarat as well, being only an hour from the CBD, it just gives people the best of both worlds when it comes to lifestyle and employment opportunities. And again, I'd rather sit on a train for an hour and read a book than sit in traffic for an hour or 2 hours and nudge along on the freeway.
And that train link is so important that you mentioned the regional rail link. There's further upgrades going on right now. They're spending hundreds of millions of dollars right now on further improvements. And then there's that additional element that's perhaps been more recently announced, and that's the whole linkage to the airport in Melbourne, and that's going to have benefits for train services out of Ballarat as well.
Yeah, well, it's a $555 million upgrade. And this is what I said at the beginning of the webinar, that there is so much money being invested in Victoria across these three areas that I think there's more money being invested in Victoria from an infrastructure point of view than what there is for the rest of the country put together. So that's why these areas are performing so well and why they're likely to continue to hold their ground and continue to perform over time as well. Okay, so let's talk about, Bendigo. All right, so again, a strong regional centre. Again, has benefited from the $5 billion regional rail link that's been finished recently. It's had solid population growth. 630 million has been invested into the Bendigo Hospital. It's got good proximity to Melbourne, obviously accessed through the north. There's a $250 million Evergreen Waters project. It's got quite a diverse economy. And there's a contract that's just been awarded to a local business for a $1.3 billion Australian Defence Force project. And there's an airport upgrade happening there as well. So lots of activity going on there. And if we look at some of the figures, again, we can see that Bendigo's got some good variation in terms of affordability from a price point perspective. Similar to Ballarat, albeit it's going to take a little bit longer, but they're forecasting by 2055 that it's going to have a population of 200,000. It's Victoria's third largest city, and the core influences, again, are government policy, transport infrastructure, and lots of money, again, being invested into the area.
Yes, in many ways, Bendigo is similar to Ballarat. It obviously has its own character, but that factor I mentioned about Ballarat, where you have some very, very big nationally operating businesses, but locally based, and one of those you touched on is the company that gets the big contracts, manufacturing contracts from the military to build vessels for the army, for example, or vehicles rather. Heavy engineering company, very, very major employer. And you mentioned $1 billion contract that they're currently working on. That's the sort of thing that can happen in strong regional centres, and that's certainly a factor in Bendigo. That hospital, $650 million project, that was a huge factor in increasing the amenity of the city, but also creating jobs. One of the things I love about that kind of infrastructure, certain types of infrastructure, lots of jobs in creating them, such as a major new road. Once it's completed, the job creation element of that dissipates, whereas a new hospital, there's actually more jobs in running it than building it.
That's right, yeah.
That's an ongoing influence for Bendigo.
Yeah, and it's interesting because what I get a lot of, interestingly enough, is doctors who are basically coming to regional centres. They're going to be there for 12 months. They want me to help them buy a home to live in, but it's an investment grade property that when they leave, they can actually rent it out and have it as an investment property. So they get the benefit of living in it. It's deemed their principal place of residence, and then when they leave, they get a good rental yield from it as well. So that's very commonplace. I'm doing a fair bit of that too. So, and that's not just, Ballarat, that applies to Geelong and Bendigo as well, but particularly in these areas where there's money being put into the local hospitals. And again, interestingly enough, as people retire and get older, they want to be close to hospitals because they take into consideration, if they're getting older and things start falling off the wheels start falling off a little bit. Peace of mind is they want to be close to hospitals and know that they're going to get treated and have access, and they're not going to have to sit around and wait for 4, 6, 8, 10 hours to see a doctor, which is really what happens in some of the Melbourne hospitals.
Yeah, so that hospital factor is so important. Big jobs created while they're building it, even more jobs when it's finished and being operated. Improves the amenity of the city by bringing this wonderful new facility, but also it has an impact on the property market because it brings in a lot of new people and are going to be working in that very large facility, and some of them are actually earning very good money. Yeah. And that has an impact on pricing in the local market. Is that what you're finding there?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. Yep. Absolutely. And again, it's this demand of staff coming in and living there. And even if they're only doing a residency or they're contracted for 1 or 2 years, they still need somewhere to live. So from a rental perspective, there's demand there. And then, of course, there are clients, as I've just described, who actually want to buy there and live in their own home for that period of time and then leave it as an investment property when they leave. So that's something certainly I've experienced well and truly over the last 2 years in particular, working with a number of doctors in that respect. So absolutely, you've got administrators, you've got nurses, you've got doctors, you've got specialists, you've got consultants. So the hospitals bring in a lot of employment opportunity, and it contributes to the rental vacancy rates. It contributes to property prices increasing as well, and higher buyer demand as well as tenant demand.
Yeah. Now, Miriam, our observation looking at the numbers, particularly the demand numbers, the sales volumes numbers, is that Ballarat's a little bit ahead of Bendigo in the cycle, which is an advantage, I think, for buyers considering these places. Bendigo's just getting started on an upward cycle as far as we can tell from our research. We are seeing good price growth in the area already, but not as much yet as Ballarat, so that's still to come. Yeah. So I think Bendigo, in that respect, does represent an opportunity for investors and home buyers.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I'd take into consideration, though, with Bendigo being sort of more of an hour 45, maybe a 2-hour drive, depending on what traffic works are going on as well. Bendigo is great for people who are moving there permanently, but it's not so much a city that's as easy to commute from. So you're going to get less commuters in Bendigo than what you're likely to get in Ballarat. And so what that means in Ballarat, when it comes to selling, you've got a much broader market to sell to. So people who still want an affordable lifestyle and a great lifestyle but can either work in and around Ballarat, or they can commute to Melbourne or Sunshine or whatever the case may be. Again, same in Bendigo, people can partially commute, but it's unlikely they're going to do a full 2-hour commute, up to a 2-hour commute depending on traffic works each day there and back.
Just looking at the median price figures, and I know median prices can be sometimes misleading, but the impression I get is that, if anything, pricing is a little bit lower in Bendigo than in Ballarat. So certainly there are suburbs with median prices still in the 200,000, not necessarily the most desirable locations in Bendigo, but there is pretty good value for money, generally speaking, in this market.
Yeah, and look, it's important to talk to the local agents, because you can look at data like that and go, well, look, they're not good areas, but the local residents may not necessarily agree. You know, there might be a part of a suburb that's not a great area to buy in, and residents will stay clear of there. But then there are other parts of suburbs and pockets of suburbs under that collective banner that might actually be okay. And if you've got some suburbs that are particularly large, that's where you'll find that there are pockets to buy in, pockets to stay away from, and it's doing your due diligence and your research to understand which pockets they are. So don't necessarily exclude suburbs totally because you heard it's a bad suburb. Dig that little bit deeper and ask those questions and talk to the local agents about that kind of intel, because when you are talking about these low and median price points, it means that you potentially can still buy in that good part of that suburb and buy really well.
Okay. And again, as we commented previously with Geelong and Ballarat, vacancies very low, and there's some many postcodes below 1%. So again, another indication that there's strong demand coming into the city.
Yep. And again, infrastructure around education, around transport is big. There are lots of commercial developments and residential developments underway as well. So just take that into account and consideration as well. But certainly Bendigo, Ballarat and Greater Geelong really are expected to be responsible for all of Victoria's regional growth up until about 2031. So still a really strong story there to take into consideration.
Okay. And as we're getting towards the end of your presentation, I know you've still got some things you'd like to say to people, and particularly in terms of offers, but I do encourage people to give us your questions. Type your questions into either the Q&A panel or the chat panel, and they'll pop up on my screen, and either Miriam and myself will do our best to answer those questions. Do you want to deal with questions now, Miriam, before the final part of the presentation?
Yeah, sure, if you've got some there.
Yeah, we do have some coming through, and please, people, type in your questions and we'll do our best to answer all of them in the time we have available. Frank is asking, actually, we've been talking about, particularly about Ballarat and Bendigo, and he's wondering how Warragul compares with those places. Warragul not being north of Melbourne, different to Ballarat and Bendigo, which we've been discussing, but actually up to the east, and that's showing a lot of growth. Do you have any thoughts on that location? I know.
I'm sorry, I can't comment on Warragul because I just haven't been focusing on there and I haven't been buying out there. But the same fundamentals apply. It always comes down to growth drivers. So again, look for multiple growth drivers: employment opportunity, infrastructure, local amenity, population growth. So wherever you're looking, take into account that there have to be multiple growth drivers, and then look at the amount of investment being put into Warragul, not just by private organisations and corporations, but by government, both state and federal.
That's a good point, Miriam. What we know to be true from our research for Warragul is that it's attracting a lot of attention out of Melbourne because it's quite close, but it's a lot more affordable, not just for home buyers and investors, but also for commercial businesses. So perhaps businesses that might have some sort of link, say, to the Western Port need to be close to that. Warragul's a viable place to be. Land's cheaper, premises are cheaper, and we have actually seen considerable population growth in, this is the local government area known as Baw Baw, a lot of population growth and very, very high growth in prices in the last 12 months, above 20% in towns like Warragul and Drouin. So perhaps the best time to have bought there was maybe 18 months ago, but probably still some growth to come. Miriam, Janendra was asking about Wyndham Vale. Now, Wyndham Vale is actually not regional Victoria, but it's sort of on the fringes of the Melbourne metropolitan area, heading down towards Geelong. Do you have any thoughts on that area?
Look, one thing I'll say in those areas is, again, have a look at what's around, particularly have a look at how much land is yet to be subdivided and sold in that area. If it's an area in isolation with not very much around and it's got a lot of new subdivisions and so forth being developed, just take into consideration that ongoing supply of land can dampen capital growth. And if you've got an affordable entry price point that's the equivalent of someone having a mortgage and that amount equates to paying you rent, you may find that if you're buying and developing there or, building house and land, whatever the case may be, that you might struggle to rent it, because if it's the same amount of money to buy your own place as it is to rent, well, you might find that you're going to have some challenges there. But no, again, I haven't been focusing on that area specifically. So Terry, you're probably in a better position to comment on that than me.
Well, it's been a very, very popular area particularly for first home buyers and some investors. The best time to have bought there was a couple of years ago. They've had massive price growth in the last 2 years. Wyndham Vale, Werribee.
And the harbour.
Yeah, Point Cook, Hoppers Crossing. And past the peak of the cycle, there's still some price growth happening. But if you're thinking about buying in there as an investor, I suggest there's better areas now to focus on. I'd be focusing more on the regional areas a little bit outside of Melbourne that we're talking about today.
The one thing I'll add to that, Terry, is certainly in and around Point Cook. Definitely Truganina and Tarneit, you've got access to a train line, but Point Cook you don't. I'm pretty sure Wyndham Vale, I haven't got a map in front of me, but you want to make sure you've got access to Melbourne via a train line if you're going to buy there, because certainly I know the commute from Point Cook can be up to 2 hours in the morning and then 2 hours at night time. So while people are getting fantastic big, large blocks of land and 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom homes, and they've got a really nice lifestyle out there, what's killing a lot of people is the commute to and from Melbourne because there's no train line.
Okay. We have a question from Kodak, and hello Kodak, I know you and I have spoken in the recent past. He's talking about median house prices coming down in Melbourne and Sydney. How much impact will this have on regional area price growth? Because there seems to be a ripple effect both ways, you're suggesting, Kodak. I'm not sure that's the case. I'm very much a strong believer that real estate markets come out of local events. There tends to be a school of thought that markets follow one another. I don't think that's necessarily true. What do you think, Mary?
No, I'm on the same page as you, Terry. We're looking at these regional areas in terms of what's going on with them, and again, all the growth drivers that are going on there don't indicate that anything is going to change in the near term because those growth drives exist. So it's almost a little bit irrelevant around what's going on with the median price point in Melbourne because it's a totally different market.
Yeah. Miriam, you touched on house and land packages with a certain element of warning earlier in your presentation. Andrea's asking, would you be able to elaborate on house and land packages in these growth areas, how buying in the early stages versus the later stages works or doesn't work as an investment strategy?
Yeah, well, I think one thing people need to realise is when you buy a house and land package, there's an element of risk associated with it, just like there is buying an off-the-plan apartment. The risk is basically associated with who's the developer, who's the builder, how reputable are they, will they finish the development in a timely manner, do they have the right insurances in place, can they show you what their work looks like. So that type of investment is always riskier than buying an established property. So that's the first thing. This is the sort of stuff I talk about in my book. When you buy for land value, it's the land that goes up in value, not the house. So houses will depreciate, whereas land appreciates. So when you're buying a house and land package, you might only be buying 30% land value and then 70% of the purchase price is tied up in the house. So the developer makes a nice big profit, but you end up with very little land value and therefore a reduced capacity for that land to grow in value, because as they release more and more stages of land in particular subdivisions, well, if you get in at the very beginning, great, there's a potential for you to make some money, but it will depend on when those stages are released, if they in fact increase the prices of each stage, and you may find that they're not increasing those prices, so you're hoping for a big upswing in capital growth and you may not get it, because a tendency to have an ongoing supply without sufficient demand to absorb it basically results in capital growth being dampened or slowed down. So from an investment perspective, even if it is on the perimeter of Ballarat or Bendigo, you may well find that you're actually better off investing closer into town, buying something established with a higher land value, and you've got the potential to earn more capital growth there. You may not get depreciation benefits, you may not get stamp duty savings, but fundamentally it's possibly going to be a better asset.
I actually think, Andrea, that how much benefit you get out of taking that new build approach depends on how you approach it, whether you actually come in as an investor and buy the end product, as opposed to whether you actually act as a developer yourself and get a block of land and build the home yourself effectively as the developer. I think the potentially better outcomes from that approach in terms of new build.
And again, Terry, on that note, I'll come back to, if you want to develop, then you really need to understand your personal risk profile. Again, I've referenced this in my book, Property Prosperity, because I often have clients coming to me who identify that they've got a low risk profile. They're pretty nervous about investing in high risk strategies or high risk property types, yet they want me to help them find a development site which is ostensibly is high risk. So it's important that if you are going to do anything like developing, that you understand and assess your own personal risk profile to make sure that whatever you do end up doing matches that profile, so basically you can sleep at night. Because the reason people make a lot of money on developments is there's a lot of risk associated with it, and you won't get a high return without that high risk. And if you don't want that high risk, well then developing may not be for you. There might be other ways in which you can make some great capital growth without taking that level of risk.
And if you do take that approach, it's very important to have a very good team around you, that you don't attempt it alone, that you have good expertise on your team, good advice that you have access to. Danny's asking, can you comment please on the amount of new development in Geelong, Bendigo? Land is hard to get, he says, particularly registered land. What are you finding, Miriam?
Well, you do have a lot of development going on, particularly Geelong Armstrong Creek. I mean, that's thousands of blocks of land that will come to the market over time. You do have a lot of big developers that have come in and they've been land banking for a number of years. So, you might come across the odd block of land here and there, but if you're competing against large developers who have been land banking for a period of time, well then, you are going to probably struggle to find a block of land to develop. You're likely to be able to find that probably again closer into Bendigo, closer into Ballarat, or pockets of those particular regional areas. I mean, again, Geelong, well, it depends on how much money you've got. You might need to go a little bit further out, and it depends on what your objective is. Is it to buy, is it to develop and subdivide and build, or is it to buy your own home? So you just have to be aware of who the competition is and work around that and talk to your local agents. Just let them know what you're after, ask them what the sort of availability is, how tightly held is that stock. Just do some feedback, get some feedback in that respect.
I had a question actually prior to the webinar today, Miriam, about land prices in Ballarat in particular, an observation that it seemed that land prices are rising as quickly as house prices. Are you finding any evidence of that in Ballarat?
I don't buy land, so I can't comment. I only buy investment grade properties that are basically established with a high land value and therefore strong potential for capital growth. So sorry, that's just the philosophy that I work with my clients on, and they all make a lot of money and they're all getting good yields, and why change what works? So I'm sorry, I can't really comment on the land side of it.
Okay. Another question that's probably more fringe Melbourne than regional Victoria, but asking how we feel about Melton. That's a question from Gian. Do you operate in that area at all, Miriam? Again,
I'm not buying there. One thing I'll say about those outer areas is there has been a substantial upswing in prices of late, lots of subdivision and development going on there as well. Certainly in Melton and some of those northwestern suburbs in particular, you've got a lot of foreign, for want of a better word, not refugees, that's not quite the right word, but different socioeconomic and cultural groups that are relocating to that area. Often they've got big families, they're buying and building bigger homes to accommodate their families, but in some areas it's putting a lot of pressure on the local infrastructure, because I know certainly one council in particular, I can't recollect the name of it at the moment, but with their planning and their growth, I know they work on an average of 2.3 kids per family, and they've had a lot of people people migrating into the area with 3 or 4 children, and they've been caught short in the local primary school and suddenly had to put in 10 portables to accommodate the population going from 300 in one year to 500 the next. So just be wary that population growth alone isn't necessarily a good reason to buy, because it doesn't mean that growth will be sustainable. And if you're buying in areas where local council and local government don't have the infrastructure to keep up with that growth, well, then you can have issues around access to public transport. You can have lack of employment opportunities. I know in some of the northwestern suburbs, while you've got massive population growth, you've also got the highest level of unemployment and people on the dole in Broadmeadows in particular. So just be aware of that.
I think you're right. Some people have a very simplistic follow the population growth strategy. It can be a strategy for pure population growth is a factor, but it's simply the be all, and you need to consider it in conjunction with a whole heap of other factors. There are still more questions, but I am mindful of the time, Miriam, so I think we should move on to the final part of your presentation and invite people who still have questions, would like to follow up, to contact you later today or in the coming days if they have further things to talk about.
Sure. And look, just to reiterate, we buy high-performing investment-grade homes and properties for clients. So if anyone would like some help, particularly buying in these regional areas, it literally is the quick or the dead sometimes. I can drop everything, go up to a regional centre, look at a property in the morning, and we have to have an offer in that afternoon. And in that time, we've done our due diligence. So we're talking about really hot markets at the moment. So if you're struggling to get in or knowing what to spend or how much to pay or what's a good property, certainly we can help you with that. So I'd like to offer everyone the opportunity for a free consultation. If you go onto my website, just under the resources and contact section, under the resources, if anyone's interested in learning more about buying for land value and things like that, my book Property Prosperity is $29.95 normally. If you click here and buy the Kindle version, you can do that for $3.99. Or if you shoot me an email, and I'll give you my email address shortly, I'm happy to sell you the book for $19.95 plus postage. So that's my offer to everyone today. And what I'd certainly like to also suggest is feel free to give the gift of education for Christmas. So if you've got any family or friends or work colleagues who are interested in learning about property investing and they want to do it the same way as an expert, there's a lot of detail in the book around that. So like I said, email me for the $19.95 offer plus GST. And if you'd like...
Miriam, could I just pop in? I noticed what you had on screen there. You had some testimonials for your book. One of them was actually from me, and I was just
interested. Right.
Whenever I read a book, particularly a book on property investment, I'm always highlighting passages that I think are noteworthy. And what I say there, I know it was true at the time. I've highlighted more passages in Property Prosperity than any other real estate book I've read in the past 5 years. That was a very, very good indicator that I was getting lots of useful information out of that book. It's one of the best I've read on the subject of property investing.
Thanks, Terry. And look, whether you've bought property or not, I would guarantee that you'd probably learn something out of this. I take a financial planning approach to direct property investing. That's why it's important to understand your risk profile, have a strategy and a plan in place, know and understand what research you need to do and what growth drivers you need to take into account, because it's as much what you need to know to not make a mistake as well as what you need to know to maximise your opportunity. And in reality, you don't necessarily need 5 or 10 properties to create the financial security you want. You might just need 2 or 3 really good investment grade properties, and this book will give you an indication as to how to go about that. So I'm losing my voice. As I offered, if anyone would like a free consultation, you're trying to buy in any of these areas and you're stuck and you'd like to know how I can help you, feel free to hop on the website on the contact form and fill that form in. Other questions, or if you'd like to take me up on my book offer for $19.95, just shoot me an email at miriam@propertymavens.com and I'm happy to send you the link and get a book out to you before Christmas.
Okay, well, nicely timed finale, because we're just come up on the hour, and it's a nice time to wrap things up. Thank you for your presentation and your knowledge and your experience today, Miriam. I've found it personally interesting. I'm personally interested in investing in the areas we've been discussing today. Certainly very high on my list of prospects, and so it's been interesting to get your insights. Particularly around one of your early comments was don't filter with a CBD or capital city perception. I think it's a very, very important point to make, that a lot of people are coming out of the capital cities looking now at regional areas because that's where the growth is, and also offering a great affordability comparison and better rental yields. But if people do bring that capital city mentality, they can make mistakes thinking that what they know of their own city applies to a regional city like Ballarat or Bendigo. I think the point you made about climate and the importance of heating and air conditioning in these locations, perhaps more so than other locations, was a point well made. And the importance of using local professionals when you're doing the due diligence checks, such as building and pest inspections. So lots of great information, lots of great insights. Thank you again, Miriam. It's always great to do these webinars with you because you're at the coalface and you always bring such good knowledge and experience and expertise to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Terry. It's been great chatting with you today, as always.
Okay, thank you everybody for participating. Please be aware that everyone who's registered for the webinar today, we will be sending follow-up emails with links so that you can watch it again, or those who weren't able to tune in live today will be able to watch a recording of it at their leisure. Anybody would like to follow up with Miriam, the contact details on the screen. I certainly urge you to do so if you're interested in these particular areas, which I do strongly recommend. We're just about to produce the next edition of our National Top 10 Best Buys reports, and Ballarat and Bendigo feature very prominently in our consideration for that very important report. So
Terry, I'd like to just add that the reports are very useful. Certainly they form part of some of the research that we do. So there's some really good content in there. And that's an independent view. So I just wanted to share that as well. Excuse me. So yeah, good information in those reports. And Terry will also send out a link to my book offer and the free consultation as well.
Yes. Okay, so that's it for now. Thanks everyone for participating. If you'd like to follow up, please contact Miriam by email or by phone. Thank you for your participation. Over and out from Terry Ryder of Hotspotting and Miriam Sandcooler of Property Mavens.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye for now.